When a crew sets sail on like a massive cargo ship crossing the Atlantic, there's this fundamental understanding about how navigation works. I mean, it requires total precision.
Right. It requires engineering.
Exactly. The navigator steps up to the helm, they check the magnetic compass, plot the coordinates against a physical map, and they point to the horizon. And they say, there is true north. It's not a suggestion, it's an objective reality.
Yeah, it's an absolute binary. I mean, either you are heading north or you are not. And human civilization we've always found immense comfort in that. We inherently crave things that are measurable, things that are anchored to an unyielding physical reality outside of our own minds.
But imagine what happens if you step into the world of modern cultural philosophy or institutional politics. Suddenly, that navigational landscape looks completely different. You walk onto the bridge of the ship, and the compass has been deliberately smashed to pieces. We are looking at a society that is, honestly, it's completely unmoored.
It is the absolute definition of steering a vessel by the chaotic, unpredictable winds of subjective feeling.
And that profound shift, how we lost the compass and why the ship might literally be heading for an iceberg, is exactly what we're getting into today. So welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before we chart a course into today's topic, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It is the absolute best way to support this deep dive and ensure you never miss our explorations of these, really complex ideas.
Yeah, it really does help the show grow.
Because today's mission is monumental. We are unpacking an ultra-long, highly incisive, and honestly completely fascinating new ebook published this year, 2026. It is titled Epistemological Cuckoldry: How Postmodernists Robbed Men of Objective Reality, and it's by Conrad Riker. Now, quick heads up on our target audience for this specific text. If you are interested in the intellectual foundations of the manosphere, or if you follow men's rights advocacy or consider yourself red-pilled, this text was written specifically as a philosophical arsenal for that worldview.
It really was.
Yeah. Riker is essentially tracing the entire history of Western institutions before, as he argues, they were captured and dismantled by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
And before we unpack a single page of this, I really need to firmly clarify the ground rules for today's discussion. The source material we are examining today, it contains highly politically charged content. It is fiercely critical of left-wing paradigms and explicitly advocates for right-wing manosphere viewpoints. So I want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides here.
Right, we're staying neutral.
Exactly. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, nor are we condemning them. Our mission today is strictly analytical. We are going to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material, examine the author's logic, and just understand the framework he is presenting.
Yeah, we are simply the tour guides walking you through the architecture of this book. And honestly, to truly grasp the monumental scope of this work, because we can only cover a fraction of it today, you really should check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book for yourself. You also need to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how these arguments are developing. So let's get into it. Set the stage for us. What is the central thesis of this massive book, and what exactly does Riker mean when he talks about the murder of Logos?
Well, what is genuinely fascinating about Riker's approach is that he entirely bypasses the usual modern culture war talking points. He doesn't start with social media algorithms or modern political elections. He starts at the very bedrock of Western epistemology.
Right.
His foundational argument is that Western civilization is quite literally committing suicide by swallowing what he terms the poison of subjectivism. And to grasp the weight of that claim, we first have to define the concept of logos.
He traces this back thousands of years, right? I mean, this isn't a new concept at all.
Not at all. He goes all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus around 500 BC. Heraclitus used the term logos to describe the rational, universal, ordering principle of the cosmos. And later, this concept was heavily integrated into early Christian theology.
Like in the Gospel of John, right?
Exactly. The opening of the Gospel of John in the beginning was the word, the logos. It signified the idea that there is an invisible, objective, rational architecture to reality. Fire burns, gravity pulls, 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of human perception or emotion.
It just is.
It just is. And the West, according to Riker, was built entirely on the singular premise that the universe is inherently rational and measurable. If men humble themselves before this objective truth and align their actions with it, they can build a functioning, enduring civilization.
So logos is essentially the operating system of objective reality. But Riker's premise is that logos didn't just naturally fade away as society modernized. He argues it was murdered. like a premeditated assassination.
Yes. He frames it as a multi-generational philosophical heist. He traces the lineage of this intellectual shift incredibly meticulously. He argues the first major blow was struck in the 1700s by Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Okay, what did Rousseau do?
Rousseau introduced the seeds of Romanticism, specifically the concept of the noble savage. This was the idea that human beings are inherently pure in their primitive emotional state, and it is the strictures of civilization and objective reason that corrupt them. So Rousseau elevated primitive subjective sentiment over civilized objective reason.
Wow, so it sounds like the first crack in the foundation, like the exact moment feeling started to compete with fact.
That is exactly how Riker positions it. But the fatal theoretical blow, he argues, came shortly after with Immanuel Kant in 1781 with his critique of pure reason. Kant introduced what he himself called his Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack this, break that down for us, because Kant is famously dense. How does Kant's philosophy act as a weapon against objective reality?
Well, before Kant, the general assumption was that reality exists independently of us, and our human minds act like mirrors trying to reflect that reality accurately. If the mirror is smudged, we make an error, but the tree outside our window is still objectively a tree.
Makes sense.
But Kant completely inverted this. Just as Copernicus proved the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth, Kant argued that the human mind doesn't revolve around objects. Rather, objects revolve around the mind. He posited that the mind doesn't just passively perceive reality, it actively constructs it through innate categories of space and time.
Wait, so if I'm following Riker's critique of this, Kant is basically saying the human mind is wearing permanent virtual reality goggles. Like we only see the software rendering of the world, never the actual source code of reality itself.
That is a brilliant analogy. Yes, Kant said we can never know the noumenal world, the thing in itself. We can only know the phenomenal world, which is reality as it appears to us after being heavily filtered by our cognitive apparatus. Now, Kant was a rigorous thinker who believed all humans shared the exact same cognitive software, meaning we could still agree on universal laws of math and physics. But Riker argues that Kant accidentally opened a catastrophic Pandora's box, because once you establish the premise that the observer actively constructs reality, it is only a matter of time before later philosophers ask, well, what if different observers construct entirely different realities based on their unique experiences?
Which sets the perfect stage for Friedrich Nietzsche in the late 19th century.
Precisely. In 1882, Nietzsche famously declared the death of God. And Riker interprets this not merely as an observation on the decline of religious belief, but as the severing of morality and truth from any transcendent objective anchor. If God is dead, then universal truth is dead, and all that remains is individual will. And the final fatal blow in this lineage, according to the book, was delivered by the French postmodernist Michel Foucault in the 1970s.
Oh man, Foucault is everywhere when you start looking into modern cultural critique. What is his specific role in Riker's theory of this murder?
Foucault took the implications of Kant and Nietzsche to their absolute extreme. He argued that objective truth simply does not exist. Instead, what we casually refer to as truth or knowledge is merely a rhetorical weapon.
A weapon?
Yes, a construct created by those in power to subjugate the weak. Foucault claimed that every society operates on an episteme, a system of thought that dictates what is considered true or false, entirely based on an ongoing power struggle.
So if we trace this lineage, Rousseau makes feelings as important as facts. Kant argues we can't actually access objective facts anyway. Nietzsche says there is no ultimate judge of facts. And then Foucault finally says that anyone claiming to have facts is just an oppressor trying to control you.
That is the exact trajectory Riker outlines. We move from doubting reality to denying reality to replacing reality entirely with a political power struggle.
But, I mean, philosophy in a vacuum is just a bunch of guys arguing in a library. Riker claims this leaped out of the academy and fundamentally altered the real world. And he gives this incredibly stark example of how this epistemological shift played out in the medical community. He points to the 1973 American Psychiatric Association conference, specifically regarding the declassification of homosexuality as a mental illness. Now, we need to be very clear here for the listener. Riker is not spending this chapter arguing the medical merits or morality of homosexuality. He is laser-focused on the mechanism of how that medical reclassification happened.
Yes, his focus is entirely on the methodology of institutional change.
Right, because Riker points out that this monumental shift in psychiatric classification wasn't achieved through rigorous scientific debate. It wasn't the result of a decade-long double-blind study or a breakthrough in neurological empirical data. He documents how activists quite literally stormed the psychiatric conferences, seized the microphones, screamed at the speaking psychiatrists, and intimidated the professionals in the room until a vote was held to change the diagnostic manual.
And for Riker, that specific moment in 1973 was the ultimate paradigm shift in Western institutions. It vividly proved to the radical intelligentsia that mob emotion and political intimidation could successfully override the objective scientific process.
Wow.
I mean, if an institution can be bullied into altering its scientific literature based on political pressure, then the scientific method itself is compromised. Riker argues that when you surrender the map of reality to the screaming mob, you don't appease them, you merely embolden them to burn the entire territory.
Which brings us to a modern linguistic trend that Riker absolutely despises, the explosion of the phrase, my truth. He views this as the ultimate manifestation of Foucault's philosophy trickling down to the masses.
He literally calls it a grammatical and philosophical abomination.
Yeah, he actually cites Google Ngram data, which tracks the frequency of words in printed books over time, showing how the usage of my truth just absolutely skyrocketed post-2010. And his logical breakdown here is fascinating. He points out that putting a possessive pronoun like my in front of a universal absolute like truth instantly destroys the concept of the absolute.
Exactly. You cannot possess truth. Truth is an external reality that is supposed to possess you. It is supposed to force you to conform to it.
Right.
And if you look at the broader implications, Riker is arguing that reducing reality to my truth collapses the entire cosmos into a solipsistic echo chamber. It creates a society where empirical facts are forced to yield to emotional tantrums. He says the postmodernists have deliberately conflated ontology with epistemology.
Okay, let's define those two terms for the listener because they're so crucial to his argument.
Certainly. So ontology is the philosophical study of what is physically real, the nature of being. Epistemology is the study of how we perceive or acquire knowledge about what is real. Riker argues that just because human perception, our epistemology, is flawed or limited, it does not mean that the physical universe itself, our ontology, is fluid or subjective.
Okay, let me pause you right there because I want to push back on Riker's framing for a second. I understand the philosophical frustration with the phrase my truth. It is super annoying when someone uses it in an argument to avoid being proven wrong. But is this really a civilization-ending crisis? Like, is this abstract debate about ontology versus epistemology actually changing the physical world? Or is Riker just angry about semantic shifts on college campuses? Does this genuinely alter physical reality?
Well, Riker would argue that it absolutely alters physical reality because the people making policy decisions are operating on this flawed software. Ideas have physical consequences.
And to prove that, he uses this brilliant analogy of the cargo ship, which we touched on at the very start of the deep dive. He says, imagine a massive cargo ship crossing the freezing Atlantic. The crew, infected by this postmodern subjectivism, decides to mutiny. They murder the navigator, who represents logos, that connection to objective reality. They smash the magnetic compass. They decide that the traditional rules of navigation are oppressive constructs. From now on, every sailor gets a turn to steer the massive ship based purely on their lived experience and their personal truth.
Right. One sailor steers based on how the wind makes him feel, another steers by reading his daily horoscope.
Exactly. And in theory, within the confines of the ship's bridge, it looks like the ultimate egalitarian utopia. Everyone's feelings are equally validated.
But they're completely ignoring the ontology of the ocean.
Yes. And then, inevitably, the ship plows into an iceberg. Riker points out with his brutal clarity, the freezing water rushing into the hull is not a social construct. The ship will sink according to the objective, unyielding, and highly mathematical laws of fluid dynamics.
The ocean does not care about the crew's feelings.
It does not care about their consensus. It drowns them all equally. The iceberg is an objective reality, and if you destroy the compass of reason, hitting it is a mathematical certainty.
It is a stark analogy, but it raises a critical mechanical question. How did a fringe academic philosophy about smashing the compass manage to escape the faculty lounges and capture the entire Western institutional framework? Because abstract philosophy doesn't enforce itself.
Right.
Riker argues that this epistemology of subjectivism was weaponized by highly organized, deeply strategic political movements. And this leads us to explore the historical mechanism he calls the Marxist metastasis.
Okay, this part of the book is where the focus shifts from philosophy to political history. He argues that the concept of class warfare was deliberately transmuted into gender warfare. But to understand that pivot, we have to look at the failure of original Marxism.
Right. Raker points out that traditional Marxism, as outlined by Karl Marx in Das Kapital in 1867, was strictly focused on material economic class struggle. The binary was simple. The bourgeoisie, who owned the means of production, the factories, the capital versus the proletariat, the working class who sold their labor. Marx predicted that the working class would become so impoverished and exploited that they would inevitably rise up in a violent global revolution.
But by the mid-20th century, a massive problem emerged for the Marxist theorists, particularly in the West. The revolution wasn't happening.
Exactly. Because Western capitalism, despite all its flaws, produced unprecedented wealth. The working class acquired homes in the suburbs, 2 cars in the driveway, televisions, and a standard of living that completely nullified their desire to overthrow the government.
They got comfortable.
The traditional working class became comfortable. They became stakeholders in the capitalist system. So, according to Riker, Marxist intellectuals realized that relying on the factory worker was a lost cause. Thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School, particularly Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, recognized they needed a completely new strategy.
If the proletariat is busy mowing their lawns, you need to invent a new proletariat. You need a new revolutionary vanguard to tear down the system.
And they found it by building a coalition of the marginalized. Riker argues that the most potent and successful weapon in this new revolutionary arsenal was the weaponization of feminism.
Okay, how so?
Well, the intellectuals took the traditional Marxist oppressor versus oppressed binary and simply swapped out the economic labels for gender labels. Men, universally, were recast as the eternal oppressors, the new bourgeoisie. Women, universally, were cast as the perpetually oppressed proletariat. Riker terms this resulting sociological framework the mimetic misandry matrix.
Okay, let's unpack that phrase, because he uses a lot. Mimetic misandry matrix. Misandry obviously means the hatred of men. Matrix refers to the pervasive system. But what does he mean by mimetic in this context?
Mimetic, deriving from mimesis, means to imitate or copy. Riker is asserting that modern radical feminism isn't an original philosophical movement. It is a mimetic copy of Marxist class warfare. It mimics the exact structure, vocabulary, and revolutionary goals of Marxism, but merely pastes the concept of patriarchy over the concept of capitalism. By creating this matrix, the ideologues successfully revived the revolution, not by targeting bank accounts, but by targeting biology.
But a theory like that doesn't just spontaneously take over the government overnight. Riker charts how this was a highly strategic, top-down, multi-decade operation. He uses another specific term here, the Gramscian long march through the institutions. For the listener who might not be familiar with early 20th century Italian communists, who is Antonio Gramsci and how does his strategy apply here?
Sure. Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist theoretician who was imprisoned by Mussolini in the 1920s. While in prison, he wrote extensively on why the communist revolution failed in Western Europe. He theorized the concept of cultural hegemony.
Okay.
Gramsci realized that in Western societies, power isn't just held by the police or the military, it is maintained by the culture, the churches, the schools, the media, the family. He argued that you cannot overthrow a capital society by simply seizing the factories by force. The culture will reject you. Instead, revolutionaries must embark on a long march through the institutions. They must quietly infiltrate the universities, the press, and the courts, and slowly change the culture from the inside out until Marxist values become the new common sense.
And Riker points to the year 1970 as a major, undeniable beachhead in this long march. That year, San Diego State University established the very first women's studies department in the United States. Now, Riker argues this was not established to expand objective, scholarly inquiry in the tradition of a biology or physics department. He claims it was the construction of an academic safe house for political activism.
Yeah.
It was, in his words, a secular seminary designed specifically to train ideological cadres who would then be deployed out of academia and into human resources departments, law schools, and federal bureaucracies.
And we see the practical legislative fruits of that ideological training, according to the text, a few decades later. He highlights the 1991 report published by the American Association of University Women,
Right.
titled How Schools Shortchange Girls. This report was massively influential. It claimed that the entire educational system was systemically biased against female students, crushing their self-esteem and academic prospects.
But Riker tears this report apart, right? I mean, he cites subsequent investigations by scholars like Christina Hoff Sommers, who proved the data was incredibly skewed.
Yes, Riker argues the report was fundamentally flawed and empirically bankrupt. Yet it was wildly successful in its actual goal fabricating a massive institutional victimhood narrative. Because of that report, Congress passed the Gender Equity in Education Act, redirecting hundreds of millions of dollars in resources. For Riker, this proves the Gramscian model works. The goal of these academic departments isn't to uncover objective truth. It is to produce politically actionable propaganda to justify a hostile takeover of public resources.
And the philosophical shield they use to deflect any criticism of this data manipulation is a concept called standpoint epistemology. This is a huge part of the postmodern framework. It basically posits that your social status, specifically your status as a marginalized victim within the oppressor-oppressed matrix, determines your access to the truth.
Right.
If you belong to the oppressor class, you are inherently blind to reality. If you belong to the victim class, you have a special enlightened sight.
It completely abandons the scientific method of objective measurement in favor of demographic identity. The validity of an argument is no longer based on the evidence presented, but on the identity of the person presenting it.
But hold on, this is where I have to throw a flag on the play and challenge Riker's extrapolation here. Riker points out a massive contradiction. He says, if you accept this Marxist framing, that all human history is just men violently oppressing women, then you have to view the physical world men built through that lens. He claims that under this logic, the invention of penicillin or the paving of roads or the building of the electrical grid aren't triumphs of human ingenuity, they are acts of systemic violence. But is he providing actual citations of prominent academics saying, asphalt is oppressive? Or is this just a rhetorical straw man he's building to make postmodernists look completely insane?
That is a crucial, critical question to ask when evaluating his text. Now, Riker does not claim that academics are writing papers stating that concrete itself is physically violent. What he is tracing is the academic literature surrounding epistemic violence and colonial infrastructure. He extensively quotes scholars who argue that the scientific method itself, the very intellectual framework required to discover penicillin or engineer a power grid, is a patriarchal, Eurocentric construct designed to dominate nature and marginalize indigenous, intuitive ways of knowing.
Oh, I see. So it's not about the penicillin itself, it's about the system that produced it.
Exactly. Riker's argument is that if the foundation, the objective scientific method, is deemed by these theorists to be a tool of patriarchal oppression, then every fruit born of that tree, from modern medicine to civil engineering, is inherently tainted by that original systemic violence. He calls it a profound psychosis that pathologizes the very civilization that keeps these same academics fed, warm, and safe. If the light bulb is merely a symbol of male supremacy, then the entire modern world is viewed not as an achievement, but as a crime scene.
Wow, it's like epistemological suicide. You are sawing off the very branch you are sitting on. But Riker notes that once this academic base was secured and these concepts became normalized, these newly minted ideological commissars didn't just stay on college campuses. They began their march into the corporate and educational spheres, leading to what he, very vividly and darkly, calls the abattoirs.
The slaughterhouses.
Yeah.
This brings us into chapters 7 and 8 of the book. Riker details how, in his view, the foundational institutions of everyday life, school, and workplaces have been hostily re-engineered to explicitly target and suppress masculine energy. Let's examine the educational system first.
The educational abattoir. How does he claim they changed the schools?
He argues there was a deliberate ideological shift away from the classical model of education toward the progressive model. For centuries, the classical model, which arguably built Western civilization, relied on rigorous recitation, intense competition, direct instruction, and a high demand for physical vigor and discipline. It honored and constructively channeled the natural masculine spirit of contest, hierarchy, and mastery.
It demanded excellence and operated on objective measurement. Like you either got the math problem right or you failed.
Correct. But the progressive model, which Riker claims was heavily influenced by critical theory and feminist pedagogy, systematically dismantled that structure. Absolute, objective truth was replaced with collaborative, feelings-based learning. Objective grading and standardized measurement were increasingly replaced with continuous subjective assessment and grading on effort. Most damagingly, according to Riker, the demand for physical vigor was replaced by an absolute demand for sedentary compliance.
And he draws a direct causal line between this shift in the educational environment and the massive decline in male academic achievement over the last 40 years. He argues that this new model explicitly pathologizes boys' natural biology. If a young boy displays the very traits of masculine energy that historically built the world: competitiveness, physical restlessness, a desire to test boundaries, he isn't guided or mentored. He's penalized. He's treated like a defective girl.
And if the penalization doesn't force compliance, Riker points out the next step: medicalization. The boy is sent to the school psychologist, diagnosed with a hyperactivity disorder, and drugged with amphetamines like Adderall or Ritalin until he complies with the sedentary demands of the progressive classroom.
He views it as a modern inquisition against the masculine spirit, except instead of using torture devices, they dress it up in the clinical, empathetic language of therapeutic intervention. And what's fascinating here is how he traces this exact same dynamic demand for compliance, punishment of masculine traits from the elementary school classroom straight into the corporate boardroom. In the corporate world, this suppression manifests as the diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI industry.
Which Riker notes has ballooned into a $12 billion a year global industry.
He literally calls DEI a tax on competence.
He does. He argues that the modern human resources department has evolved into a female-dominated enforcement arm of this postmodern ideology. He refers to it as the corporate church of woke. In this church, objective merit and raw competence are often denounced as manifestations of privilege. Meanwhile, highly capable men are routinely passed over for promotions or hiring in favor of candidates who simply check the correct marginalized demographic boxes required by the matrix.
I am so glad you brought up the corporate church of woke, because the book uses a case study here that perfectly illustrates his point about the suppression of logos in the workplace. He dedicates a significant section to James Damore. If the listener remembers, he was the Google software engineer who was very publicly fired in 2017.
Yes, a highly publicized and incredibly polarizing incident. It serves as a perfect microcosm of Riker's thesis.
Damore wrote an internal memo where he essentially pushed back against Google's ideological echo chamber regarding the lack of female engineers in tech. And what was his weapon of choice? He didn't use slurs, he didn't use hateful rhetoric, he cited mainstream, peer-reviewed, evolutionary psychological literature detailing the well-documented biological differences in interests between men and women, specifically that, on average, men are more interested in things and systems, while women are more interested in people.
Right, he used objective science to explain the gender gaps.
Exactly. And Riker uses the resulting fallout to prove his point perfectly. Damore was burned at the professional stake for the crime of reading objective facts out loud. It proved that these modern HR departments will punish objective reality with total professional excommunication if it contradicts their subjective egalitarian narrative.
It functions exactly like a religious institution protecting its sacred dogma from a heretic. The truth of the heretic statement is irrelevant. The danger is the disruption of the faith.
And this brings us to one of the most intellectually compelling parts of the book. Riker frames the modern corporate concept of unconscious bias as a secular version of original sin.
That is a very potent theological comparison. In classical theology, original sin dictates that you are born in a fallen state. You carry an invisible, inherited stain that you can never fully wash away through your own actions, which requires your constant submission to the church for ongoing absolution.
Exactly. And Riker pushes this further by introducing the falsifiability problem of unconscious bias training. This completely blew my mind. He compares a modern man sitting in an HR tribunal to Galileo facing the Roman Inquisition.
Yeah.
Galileo was told by the church to prove that the earth didn't move. But at least Galileo had a telescope.
Yeah.
He had a physical, objective tool he could point to and say, look at the math. Riker asked the reader, if a man is accused by HR of having unconscious bias, which by its very definition is invisible, unmeasurable, and undetectable even to the person who supposedly possesses it, how on earth is he supposed to prove his innocence?
He can't. And that is exactly Riker's point. He references the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, here. Popper argued that for a theory to be considered scientific, it must be falsifiable, meaning there must be a way to prove it wrong. A theory that cannot be tested or falsified belongs to the realm of theology, not science. Riker argues that the HR tribunal requires no empirical evidence of discrimination because the crime of unconscious bias is defined by its undetectability. Therefore, the innocence of the accused is structurally impossible to prove.
It's a rigged game from the moment you walk into the seminar room. You must confess to a sin you don't know you committed, to appease a bureaucracy that profits from your guilt.
And if we connect this dynamic to the broader structure of the book, Riker argues that this systematic penalization of male competence in public life, the schools and the corporations, is perfectly mirrored by the legal and romantic subjugation of men in their private lives, which shifts our focus to the most controversial chapters of the book, dealing with relationships, female nature, and the family courts.
Right. This is where we get into the heavy manosphere concepts of hypergamy, the marriage strike, and what Riker provocatively calls the state acting as a substitute husband. The book argues that modern men are currently trapped in what he directly quotes as a satanic double bind.
Let's define the mechanics of that double bind according to the text. On one hand, men are still socially expected to fulfill the ancient traditional burdens of being a provider and protector. They are expected to do the dirty jobs, build the physical infrastructure, pay the majority of the taxes, and carry the weight of financial provision. Society demands their utility.
Yep.
But on the other hand, they are simultaneously punished, both legally and socially, the moment they exhibit any traditional masculine authority or demand traditional respect in exchange for carrying that massive burden.
You are strictly commanded to be strong, but you are ruthlessly punished for flexing. You have all the responsibilities of a traditional patriarch, but none of the authority.
Precisely. And to understand the romantic dynamics that drive this, Riker leans heavily on evolutionary psychology, specifically citing researchers like Stephen Gangestad. He outlines the biological concept of female hypergamy through a framework called the dual mating strategy.
Okay, this is the alpha and the beta strategy, which is foundational to red pill theory. How does Riker explain the mechanics of this?
The evolutionary theory posits that women are biologically driven to seek out two different sets of male traits, often in different men. First, they seek alpha traits, physical dominance, high social status, aggressive confidence, symmetrical features for short-term mating to secure the best possible genetics for their offspring.
Okay.
However, evolutionary history shows that these highly dominant alpha males are rarely monogamous, reliable providers. So the second part of the strategy involves securing a beta male later in life.
The beta provider.
Yes, a man who may lack the raw genetic thrill of the alpha, but who is reliable, stable, compliant, and hardworking. The goal is to extract resources and provision from the beta to ensure the survival and comfort of the offspring.
Riker is absolutely brutal about how this plays out in modern dating. He says the beta man, who spent his 20s studying, working, and building a career, is told he is lucky to finally have a woman settle down with him in his 30s. But Riker claims this man is only being handed the withered, picked-over fields of autumn while being conscripted to pay the mortgage for a life he didn't even get to enjoy in his prime. And he claims that this biological dual mating strategy hasn't just remained a cool evolutionary quirk of the dating market. He says the modern legal system has actually codified this strategy into law.
He points to a series of monumental legal shifts over the last 50 years. No-fault divorce, the Violence Against Women Act, Title IX regulations, and the Duluth model in domestic violence intervention. Riker argues that these legislative milestones collectively destroyed the institution of marriage. They converted it from a binding, lifelong covenant into a unilateral, highly incentivized contract where only one party, the woman, holds the absolute power of dissolution and asset extraction.
He argues that no-fault divorce allows a woman to unilaterally detonate a decades-long marriage the moment her emotional vibe shifts, or she feels she needs to find herself. And the legal system will then step in, strip the beta provider of the assets he spent a lifetime accumulating, garnish his future wages, and forcibly remove him from his children's daily lives.
The state, in his view, acts as the ultimate enforcer of this hypergamous strategy, ensuring that female autonomy is fully subsidized by male labor. The state becomes the substitute husband, using the threat of police force to extract resources from the biological father.
And to back up just how ruthless this hypergamous filter really is, he drops a striking statistical analysis from Christian Rudder. Rudder was one of the co-founders of the dating site OkCupid, and he wrote a book in 2014 called Dataclysm, where he analyzed millions of raw user interactions. The data showed that women on the platform rated a staggering 80% of men as below average in attractiveness.
Which, statistically speaking, is a mathematical impossibility. In any normal distribution, by definition, only 50% of the population can be below average.
Right. But Riker uses this OkCupid data to show the epistemological break from objective reality. The women's perception of reality is totally divorced from the mathematical reality. He says it proves an extreme biological selectivity filter where the vast majority of average, decent, hardworking men are viewed as essentially invisible or inherently worthless by the modern woman.
And when those invisible men do finally manage to enter the system through marriage and fatherhood, Riker argues the system is deliberately designed to consume them. To explain how this works structurally, he points specifically to Title IV VD of the Social Security Act.
I want to spend some time on this because he claims this is the financial engine destroying the nuclear family. Explain how Title IV VD actually works. How does the government make a profit off divorce?
Title V ED was an amendment passed in 1975 to establish the Federal Child Support Enforcement Program. Riker frames it as a hybrid public-private extraction mechanism. Here is how the mechanics work. The federal government provides direct matching funds to state governments to reimburse them for the administrative costs of running child support enforcement agencies. The federal government often matches states at a rate of 66%.
Wow.
Furthermore, the federal government provides performance-based financial incentives to states based on the total dollar amount of child support they manage to collect.
So, the state collects the child support from the father, gives it to the mother, but gets a massive bonus check from the federal government based on how much money they moved. And where does that bonus money go?
It goes into the state's coffers. States can use these federal funds as administrative revenue. So, as Riker argues, you simply follow the money. This structure creates a literal bureaucratic profit motive to destroy the intact family.
But how does custody time factor into that?
Child support calculations are fundamentally tied to custody percentages. If a father fights for and wins 50-50 shared custody, his child support payment obligations drop dramatically or disappear entirely if the incomes are equal.
Right.
If the child support payments drop, the state's total amount collected metric drops. If that metric drops, the state loses out on millions in federal matching funds. Therefore, Riker argues, the family court system, which is a state entity, has a built-in structural financial bias against granting fathers 50-50 custody. The state is financially incentivized to minimize a father's custody time to maximize the extraction of his wealth, thereby maximizing the state's federal revenue stream. The government literally profits from keeping fathers away from their children.
Okay, looking at this incredibly bleak picture Riker paints, I mean, what does this all mean for the modern man? It is speaking directly to you, the listener, right now. Riker opens the entire book with a heartbreaking story in the preface. It's 2019, and he's sitting in a deposition room watching a construction worker, a guy who built a firm from nothing, 23 years of 70-hour work weeks, impeccable reputation as a father. And this man is being told by an unelected family court commissioner that his children are being relocated 300 miles away. Why? Simply because his ex-wife felt she needed a fresh start.
Yeah.
The court treated her subjective feelings as sacramental and completely ignored the man's objective evidence of faithful provision and daily presence in his kids' lives. Riker says he watched the light go out behind the man's eyes, the visceral realization of epistemological cuckoldry. So I have to ask you, looking at Riker's whole framework, does he view the massive modern decline in marriage and birth rates as a societal disease that needs to be cured, or as a symptom of this system?
He is incredibly explicit about this distinction. It is absolutely not a pathology to be cured. Riker views the plummeting marriage rates as an eminently rational response by men who have looked at the data, recognized a deeply hostile legal environment, and are choosing to adapt by withdrawing their labor and capital.
He calls it a marriage strike.
Yes. He argues that men are simply refusing to play a rigged game. It is a calculated act of risk mitigation. When the family courts treat fatherhood as a financial liability and the culture treats masculinity as a toxic sin, the rational man refuses to sign the contract that guarantees his own destruction.
But this raises a massive sociological question. If millions of men are dropping out of the system, if they are walking away from the marriage market, abandoning the corporate ladder, and rejecting the traditional paths of civic participation, where are they going? And more importantly, how is the system keeping them docile while this is happening? Because historically, when large swaths of young men are disenfranchised, there are riots in the streets. But there are no riots. Men are just quietly vanishing into their basements. This brings us to what Riker calls the media matrix and the mechanisms of psychological castration.
Riker argues that the modern media apparatus inflicts what he terms epistemic harm on the male psyche. Epistemic harm occurs when a person's ability to acquire accurate knowledge, form a healthy identity, and perceive reality is systematically distorted by external forces. And he points out a terrifying statistic. The average American male now consumes between 7 to 9 hours of screen time a day.
9 hours a day of absorbing a fabricated, curated reality.
And Riker argues this synthetic reality is designed as a deliberate pincer movement against healthy male development. On the left side of the pincer, you have mainstream corporate culture. He claims this culture is currently driven by massive institutional compliance mandates, specifically ESG environmental, social, and governance scoring.
Which controls roughly $15 trillion in investment capital. It's the social credit scorecard for corporations.
Exactly. Because of these ESG mandates, which require strict adherence to diversity and equity narratives to secure funding, Riker argues mainstream media is forced to universally portray men in one of two ways. They are either depicted as bumbling, incompetent morons, think of the trope of every sitcom dad since 1990, who is constantly outsmarted by his wife and children, or they are depicted as toxic, violent oppressors who must be defeated by a female protagonist. He cites findings from the Davis Institute showing that 71% of commercials featuring gender dynamics portray the men negatively. The cultural mandate, dictated by capital, is that any positive representation of competent, traditional male authority is strictly prohibited.
Which perfectly explains why we see massive entertainment studios pumping out movies and video games that actively insult and alienate their core male demographics. He brings up the spectacular recent failure of the video game Concord.
A very recent, very potent example of this market dynamic.
Concord was a massive budget game, heavily infused with this modern, DEI-approved ideological framing. The characters were designed specifically to subvert traditional male power fantasies, and what happened? The market issued a mathematically devastating verdict. It sold an abysmal 25,000 copies globally. The active player base dropped into the double digits within days, and Sony had to completely pull the plug and shut the servers down after just 2 weeks.
It was a total, unmitigated rejection by the consumer base.
Right. But Riker's point is that the studios keep pushing this ideological slop anyway. You'd think a capitalist company would pivot after losing hundreds of millions of dollars. Why don't they? Riker explains they don't care about the box office or the gamer. They are insulated by those ESG investors. They care about maintaining the social credit score of their corporate parent company. They are quite literally being subsidized to engineer the subjugation of the male image.
And if mainstream media is the left side of the pincer, emasculating the boy by teaching him that his innate nature is toxic or buffoonish, the right side of the pincer is the $97 billion global pornography industry.
He calls it a digital anesthetic. And the mechanics he describes here are terrifying.
Riker points out that the average age of first exposure to hardcore pornography for boys is now around 11 or 12 years old. He doesn't make a moralistic religious argument against it, he makes a neurobiological one. He describes high-speed internet pornography as a weaponized digital narcotic. It floods the developing male brain with unnatural, lethal doses of dopamine.
It's chemical warfare against human motivation.
Precisely. Evolution designed the male dopamine system to reward the immensely difficult pursuit of resources, mastery, and real-world mates. Pornography hijacks that circuitry. It distorts a young man's sexual template, annihilates his drive to pursue difficult real-world relationships with real women, and isolates him in a digital hell of effortless, sterile gratification. So the pincer movement is complete. Mainstream culture tells him his protective instinct is oppressive and unwanted, and porn whispers that his highest purpose is just passive, solitary consumption. It hollows him out completely.
I was thinking about this while reading the chapter, and the historical contrast is just staggering. Think about the anthropological record of how boys became men throughout human history. The Maasai tribe in Africa had the Unodo ceremony. A boy had to demonstrate competence, endure intense physical hardship, and literally face a lion to prove his capacity to protect the tribe. The Spartans had the Krypteia, sending young warriors into the wilderness with nothing but a spear to survive the harshness of objective reality.
Historical male initiation was always a direct encounter with physical, objective truth. It was a test against the logos.
Exactly. By stark contrast, the modern male initiation involves sitting under fluorescent lights in a corporate HR sensitivity seminar, while a 25-year-old sociology grad lectures him on his unconscious microaggressions. The Maasai face the lion. The modern man faces Linda from organizational culture. I mean, Riker asks the obvious, brutal question, which society actually survives the century? Place your bets.
It exposes a profound structural vulnerability in our civilization. But crucially, with the problem now fully diagnosed, from the philosophical murder of logos to the Marxist capture of the schools and courts to the psychological sedation of the media, Riker doesn't just leave his reader in a state of despair.
No, he doesn't. He pivots sharply to the solution.
He outlines what he calls the sovereign response.
This is chapter 14 and beyond. This is where he issues his call to action for his readers, the concept of weaponizing withdrawal. And I want to be very, very clear to our listeners, because this is where critics might misinterpret him. Riker is absolutely not advocating for violent revolution, protests, or illegal acts.
Not at all. He views violence as a trap set by the system to justify further crackdowns. Instead, he advocates for a highly rational, monastic withdrawal of male labor, capital, and participation from institutions that are fundamentally hostile to them.
He uses the monk analogy, right? Like the Benedictine monks preserving classical knowledge during the chaotic fall of the Roman Empire.
Yes. Riker argues that men must stop trying to reform a rotting feminist Marxist cathedral. The institutions are too far gone, the compass is already smashed. Instead, men must aggressively build their own parallel institutions, a fortress of competence built next to the graveyard of the old system. This means establishing homeschooling co-ops to bypass the progressive educational abattoirs. It means building private trade schools, independent media platforms, and self-sufficient entrepreneurial networks. And the foundational rule of these new institutions must be an uncompromising return to absolute merit and objective truth.
He demands a return to what he calls the transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. He frames these as the ultimate masculine archetypes. He describes them as vertical and striving, constantly reaching upward toward objective perfection, as opposed to what he calls the horizontal swamp of subjective feminine consensus, where everyone is forced to be equally mediocre.
The goal is to build an ecosystem where competence is once again honored and rewarded, not pathologized. And on a micro-personal level, Riker demands that his readers completely stop apologizing for their competence or their masculinity. He says you must treat the ideological hurt feelings of this current system with the exact same indifferent amusement you would show a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. Starve the $12 billion DEI industry of the one thing it needs to survive: your apology.
He actually gives a very specific, tactical piece of advice for navigating arguments in this culture. He says whenever you are confronted by someone demanding compliance based on their lived experience or their truth, a sovereign man must force the binary. You look them in the eye and ask a simple question. Is the statement you just made an objective fact about physical reality, or is it merely your subjective emotional opinion?
It is a brilliantly simple dialectical trap.
Exactly. Because if they admit it's subjective, you immediately dismiss it as entirely irrelevant to policy, law, or your own behavior. But if they claim it as an objective fact, they violate their own postmodern rule that absolute truth doesn't exist. You force them to fight on the battlefield of objective reality, where their emotional vibes are totally useless.
It is a demand to return to the classical trivium. For the listener, the trivium was the foundation of classical education, consisting of three parts: grammar, which is the mechanics of language and gathering objective facts; logic, which is the mechanics of thought and connecting those facts without contradiction; and rhetoric, which is the mechanics of communication and persuading others of the truth. Riker's ultimate promise to the reader is intellectual liberation through the trivium. If a man reclaims his capacity for rigorous logic and refuses to validate the emotional delusions of a decaying society, he breaks the spell. He stands as an undefeatable sovereign agent. He recovers the logos.
Let's bring this massive framework all together. Give us the final synthesis of Conrad Riker's worldview in this book.
At its core, Conrad Riker's Epistemological Cuckoldry posits that objective reality, the logos, has been systematically and deliberately dismantled over centuries. This was achieved by a coalition of postmodern philosophers, cultural Marxists, and feminist ideologues who realized they could not compete on the vertical objective axis of merit. In response, they utilized a Gramscian long march to flatten society into a horizontal matrix of grievance. The result is a modern institutional framework that actively pathologizes male competence while ruthlessly monetizing male utility through the state and the family courts. Riker's ultimate solution is absolute refusal. The sovereign withdrawal of the rational man, the embracing of the marriage strike, and the forging of a new covenant based entirely on parallel, fiercely meritocratic institutions.
It is a heavy, relentless, and undeniably thought-provoking framework. Again, to you, the listener, I want to remind you that while we have thoroughly explored and unpacked the mechanics of these arguments today, we as hosts maintain our objective stance. We are presenting Riker's deeply controversial claims impartially so that you can evaluate the logic for yourself.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on Riker's premise of systemic withdrawal. Think about the physical reality of our world. If a civilization's physical and economic infrastructure, its towering bridges, its complex power grids, its deep-sea underwater welding, its high-wire electrical maintenance, its sanitation systems, is built and maintained almost entirely by a demographic that the cultural elite simultaneously vilifies, mocks, and legally disenfranchises. What is the thermodynamic end state of that civilization when those builders simply decide to sit down and stop working? Can a society entirely run on empathy, DEI seminars, and social constructs keep the lights on when the winter storms roll in?
That is a chilling, physical question about the reality we live in. And if this deep dive resonated with your worldview, if these concepts sparked something in you or helped you understand the history of how our institutions were captured, you absolutely needed to buy this book and read the whole thing for yourself. We barely scratched the surface. Check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to purchase Epistemological Cuckoldry. And do not forget to follow the author at Conrad Negerreicher at Substack for his ongoing analysis. Finally, if you appreciated this extensive breakdown, you have to hit like and subscribe to the show so you never miss another deep dive into the ideas shaping our world. Because remember, when you're on that massive ship crossing the dark ocean and the crew decides to smash the compass to steer by the stars of their own feelings, the iceberg they hit is still an objective reality. Thanks for listening.